Hi everybody, welcome to a supplementary edition of IndyCar. The reason I'm making this broadcast this evening is because something occurred to me after this morning's broadcast that I didn't get a chance to mention. I talked at great length about what was going to happen with Brexit, the current circumstances that we find ourselves in at the moment, where it now appears as though we're going to have a vote next week on Mrs May's existing deal. And only if that deal is passed in the Houses of Parliament through the Commons will the European Union grant a 2-month extension. It's not 3 months, it's not to the end of June. This is only till the 22nd or the 23rd of May, so about 8 weeks. So if that's the case, what happens if A, we get the deal through and we Brexit in 8 weeks, but also what happens if we don't get the deal through and we end up Brexited on the 29th of this month? What then does Scotland do? What has the SNP got in the way of choices? Now, we know that Nicola Sturgeon has said that her preferred method for gaining independence, for ending the union with England in the case of being dragged out of the European Union, her preferred method was to go for a Section 30/2 of the Scotland Act. Now, this is a sort of instrument. It's a way of suspending a bit of the Scotland Act and turning it into a way of giving Scotland temporary powers to legislate for a binding, legally binding referendum on Scotland's constitutional future. Now, it would be legally binding on England. That's the important thing about Section 30. But it's not the only way you can vote about whether you want to end the Union. Section 30 order has to be granted not just by Theresa May, it also has to be granted by the Queen, because only the Queen can actually sign off on a Section 30 order and demand that it be actioned. It has to go through, first of all, Mrs May as the Prime Minister, then it has to go through the Privy Council, which is basically all of the senior politicians in the UK. Then it has to go before the Queen, who then has to sign it, then it has to be ratified. So there's a great deal of British elitist protectionism built into it that would make it, I think, almost impossible to obtain it, given the current circumstances, because simply the British establishment does not want to lose Scottish oil. And it does not want to lose its parking ground for its nuclear arsenal either. It also doesn't want to lose its cash cow in not just the oil business, but also the massive amount of exports that Scotland has overseas that count as UK exports. So for a number of reasons, I don't think that a Section 30 order will ever become forthcoming, no matter what happens. And no matter how much the SNP jump up and down and stamp their feet about it, it's not going to be forthcoming. So what did they do about it? And I went back this afternoon and I trawled through the Acts and Treaties of Union, and I looked through the Scotland Act, and I looked through dozens and dozens and dozens of other modifications and acts which superseded the Acts of Union. Most of which, I have to say, are nothing to do with Scotland, some of which are. I also looked at the Edinburgh Agreement, which was the thing that created the Section 30 order and bound David Cameron and his government to respect the result of the last referendum. The problem with all of this is that the Tories, having now been bitten once by the Section 30 order and very nearly lost Scotland the last time, they're not going to do it again. And that leaves Scotland with very few options. One of the options is to go for a general election at Scottish Parliament. But the difficulty with that is, as we all know, that the British government designed the voting system in Scotland so that the SNP, or the separatists, or the nationalists, or the Scots who don't want to be part of Great Britain, could never have a full majority in that parliament. They couldn't command 50% of the vote. The fact that once the SNP managed to get more than 50% of the seats, even with this gerrymandered, rigged system, is an absolute fluke and a miracle. I don't think it's possible to do it again, which would mean that it would be impossible to get more than 50% of the seats and actually to win independence that way. I think it would be extremely dicey and risky because, as we know, the three main British parties would club together to form the opposition to that, and that would make it extremely difficult for pro-independence parties to win a complete majority in Holyrood. It would end up with being the largest party but still in the minority, and that would not win you independence. So that cannot really be used. Then there's a general election in the UK. Now, a general election in the UK is a possibility if Mrs May's deal is voted down again next week, and it looks like we're going to crash out, and this is a humongous if the Tories haven't really planned all along for there to be a no-deal Brexit, and they really do want to save us from that, then Mrs May might resign and call a general election, in which case she can call off Brexit by rescinding Article 50, go to general election. If the Tories win again, they come back in and they can re-sign the Article 50 because they've still got the mandate. Anyway, a whole lot of things can go wrong with that as well, and it's very unlikely that the Tories will want to hold a general election so soon after the last one. They've had two general elections inside 2 years. That's not a sign of a healthy government. I don't think they'll do it again. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with really one option or two, maybe. One of the options which was discussed by, by Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who was royally screwed over by the British state after he blew the whistle on rendition flights to Uzbekistan and torture and the fact that the British state was complicit in flying people out of the Middle East and having them tortured in Uzbekistan. After he did all of that, he left the civil service, left the diplomatic service, was thoroughly they attempted to discredit him and smear him in the press when he came home, and Craig has ever since, being a good Scot, become very much a voice for independence. Craig's idea was that we should actually sort of suspend the union. We should actually do it in reverse. In other words, we actually declare ourselves independent, and that the Act of Union is null and void because of the fact that we've been dragged out of the European Union, and then hold an advisory referendum in Scotland to ratify that situation. In other words, sort of put the cart before the horse, to create a breathing space where we say we're no longer part of the UK and we're going to have a referendum to allow the people to have their say on whether that stays. Now that strikes me as being a little bit like what happened in Catalonia, where they declared independence and then almost immediately suspended that independence so that they could negotiate with the Spanish government. And that, as you may remember, didn't turn out too well for Catalonia. I'm not saying we are like Catalonia, we're not, and I don't think that is what would happen in our case. However, I don't think Craig's method would go down too well with many people in Scotland. It has too many risks attached to it and doesn't seem democratic enough. So what else does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with the famous non-binding advisory referendum. Now, I've been saying for a long time that the vote that we had on the European Union was not binding. It was advisory. And this is true. It was never a binding referendum, and it wasn't advertised as a binding referendum. It was advisory. The government wanted to see how people felt about the European Union. But then when they realised that people didn't want to be in the European Union in England, they very quickly leapt on that and thought, brilliant, that means we can get out from under the cosh of having to close all our tax islands and having to double the pensions of our pensioners. So it worked out very well for the Tory party to go along with Brexit. And all of that was on the back of an advisory referendum. But in doing this, in actioning this advisory referendum on the European Union, what England has done and what Westminster has done is created a precedent. And as we know, in a country which has no written constitution, but only has a body of law based on past history and precedents being set, they have set a new precedent, which means that an advisory referendum in Scotland would also have to be honoured by the UK government, because they honoured their own advisory referendum. They can't then say to another part of the UK, your advisory referendum won't be honoured. So we could have an advisory referendum, and the result of it would have to be honoured, and the UK government would have to negotiate with the Scottish government. It might decide to try and take Scotland to court over it. They've already tried this several times, and every time that they take us to court, it really proves nothing, because the English court system has no supremacy in Scotland. The Scottish court system has no supremacy in England. So court actions are utterly meaningless in the context of independence, or in the context of international diplomacy. It's meaningless. There's no point in taking each other to court unless it was an international court. And it could, at a pinch, take it to an international court to decide it. But I think, and I believe, that England wouldn't take it to an international court, because I'm pretty sure that, say, the European Court of Justice, for example, at The Hague, would probably say, no, Scotland voted to leave and you've got to respect that, because it was a vote by all of the people of Scotland and it was a majority, and they said they didn't want to be in the Union anymore. So that is very much an option. The problem at the moment is timing and the risks to Scotland if we delay voting on this. How do we protect Scotland from a power grab by the British state? How do we protect Holyrood from being closed down, sidelined or depowered by the Westminster government while we have this vote? And one of the things I think we can do, technically, is that we can suspend the Scottish Acts of Union. On both sides, there are Acts of Union and there are treaties of union. The treaties are the agreements between the countries, right, which basically say that the two realms, the two kingdoms, are to be joined together. Now, that doesn't mean two countries are being joined together. It means that the crowns, it means that the heads of state, the actual monarchs of the two countries, are now going to be one monarch and therefore ruled by one monarch, which is the case today, incidentally. We now have one monarch ruling two countries, which are in a union which is now called Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or something, whatever they call it now. But the point is that it's still two countries, still two distinct legal systems, neither of which is supreme in the other country. Therefore, neither country can take each other to court. Now, that means that Scotland could revoke its own Acts of Union. These are the pieces of legislation which were enacted in Scots law, which started the process of suspending the Scottish Parliament and moving it to Westminster to be part of this new Parliament of the two nations, where the Scottish Parliament sat in the same chamber in Westminster with the English Parliament. And the two together basically worked to make decisions on the two nations as a whole. All sounds fine and dandy, except for one thing, and that is that Scotland's Parliament was never shut down. It wasn't extinguished and it wasn't killed off and it never stopped. It just happens to be sitting in Westminster at the moment with the English government, or the English Parliament, sorry. The Scottish Parliament that was created by Westminster, and that was by legislation in London, is, what would you call it, is kind of like the son of the Scottish Parliament. It's officially the Scottish Parliament, but it was created by legislation in England, which is a bit bizarre. But really all it meant was that they put a building up in Edinburgh, and the Parliament which used to meet there basically restarted. So what we have in Edinburgh at the moment is what we had before the Union, which is our own Parliament, our own government, our own political parties and our own legal system, which holds it all together. And that leaves the people who are still at Westminster kind of in a never land, because they are the sort of vestiges, the last vestiges of the Scottish government, the part of it which still sits in Westminster. So they're in the middle of a kind of bizarre sort of pseudo-government at the moment. And we're neither one thing nor the other. We're sitting in the middle somewhere. But my point is that I see no reason why we can't revoke the Scottish Acts of Union These are the things which bound Scotland into law to be a part of this new realm, this new united kingdom. And if we rescind or repeal the acts in Scots law, then that means under Scots law, we can suspend the Act of Union. In other words, we can just stop it in its tracks and just stick a pin in it and stick it on the corkboard and say, we're leaving that there for the moment, whilst we have a referendum, a public vote for all the people of Scotland to decide if they want to continue to be a part of the Union of England and Scotland, or whether they want that union to end. I don't think we should be voting for independence. I think we should be voting to end the union with England, based on two simple facts. The first one is that the Treaty of Union is already broken. It was broken when the British government decided to abolish the Scottish royal boroughs. The royal boroughs were protected by the Acts of Union in 1707, and they were enshrined in law on both sides of the border. The British government unilaterally destroyed the Scottish royal boroughs, and they were gerrymandered to make it easier for the Labour Party to win more seats in Scotland. So the Treaty of Union is already broken, and that act on its own is enough in law in Scotland to say that this Union Treaty has been broken, and therefore we're not bound by it anymore, and we'll repeal these acts, and we'll suspend this union, and we won't respect it, and we're going to put it to our own people to have a vote about what they think about it. Now, the second thing which I would say breaks the Act of Union is the fact that the English Parliament has decided to pull Scotland out of a treaty with another country, a treaty which was entered into without agreement, if you remember, in 1974, where everybody in the United Kingdom voted to join the EEC. We then signed the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, and so on, which bound us closer together in the Union in Europe. And we all agreed to that. What we did not agree to in Scotland was to be taken out of that union. We voted in every constituency of Scotland. There was a majority for us to remain in Europe, and yet we're being taken out. Now, remember, this is a national issue. This is not an issue for the United Kingdom. This is a national issue for Scotland. Scotland didn't agree to leave the European Union, and I would say, on a prima facie case, that this is a real rule breaker. This is a deal breaker. This fractures the Treaty of Union in two quite easily, because it's basically saying that the English Parliament can force Scotland to do whatever they want. Whether Scotland votes for it or not, whether it agrees or not, it will not be consulted on it, it will not be listened to, and it will not be able to veto it. Now, if we were in the European Union, if Scotland was a member of the European Union, and England was a member of the European Union, let's say, hypothetically, we're both members, if England decided it wanted to change the rules of the European Union, Scotland could veto that. Likewise, if Scotland decided to change the rules of the European Union, then England, as a member, could veto that. We would be equal. But the union that we're in with England isn't equal. It's not even a union. It's a takeover. It was a hostile takeover. But having looked through the legalities of the treaties of union and the acts of union, I see nothing in there which would stop us from suspending it. I don't see any reason why Scottish politicians could not just simply announce that the Treaty of Union is suspended until further notice, while the people of Scotland are consulted in a public plebiscite where they get to vote on whether they remain in union with England or not, based on the two enormous breakages of the treaty. The destruction of royal boroughs of Scotland some time ago, and now the breaking of a treaty of union with the Europeans, which basically is one country breaking a treaty that drags another country out of a union that it doesn't want to come out of. This kind of law is not practiced anywhere else in the world, simply because there's no other country in the world which allows itself to be ruled by its next door neighbours. It just doesn't exist. There is no other country that I know of which has a a government which sits in another country's capital and decides what should happen to their country. Not only that, but decides how much of the tax money that's collected in your country is returned to you. I mean, there's no other country in the world who would put up with it. But we have for 300 years. But now we've got to the stage where we can't put up with it anymore because they've broken their own treaty, and we should have the right to suspend it. So if Mrs May's deal goes through or not, and we're out of the European Union sometime in the next 8 weeks, one way or the other we're going to be out, I think. But as soon as it's certain that's what's happening, then the Treaty of Union in Scotland should be suspended, the Acts of Union in Scotland should be repealed and abolished, and the Scottish Parliament should sit complete with all of the MPs from Westminster returning and being given additional seats at the Holyrood debating chamber, because that is really where they belong. They belong here with us. They are the last members of Parliament in Scotland, and they need to come back from England, because as soon as the treaty is over, and it is almost over now, then they need to come back, and they need to be part of the Grand Assembly of all the political elected representatives in Scotland. And I would also include in that our Scottish MEPs. They should be recalled as well, temporarily, so that everybody can sit down and have a vote, a proper vote of all of the people of Scotland on whether we want this union to continue or not. It's not about independence. It's not about anything like that. It's just about, stopping it. How'd it go? Shit. Yeah. How'd it go? How's it now? Down there? You got it? Time to go home.
Who were you talking to?
I was doing a wee